There's a very particular rhythm you start to notice when you spend time with All in the Family. And it's not the rhythm of punchlines or setups or even traditional story beats. It's something quieter, something that builds slowly, almost patiently, and then keeps returning to the same emotional ground again and again, until that ground starts to feel heavier, more charged, more meaningful. And one of the most fascinating ways the show does this is through repetition, not repetition as laziness. Not repetition as filler, but repetition as tension, as a kind of pressure that builds the more it's revisited. And there's one type of episode where you can really feel that happening, where the same argument doesn't just happen once. It echoes, it circles back. It strengthens each time it's spoken again. The episode I'm thinking of begins in that familiar living room, and there's something almost deceptive about how calm everything feels at first, like you're stepping into a moment that has already been happening long before you arrived. A space where people are comfortable enough with each other to speak freely, but also comfortable enough to repeat themselves, to revisit the same ideas without feeling like they need to move on. Archie is in his chair, of course, and that detail matters more than it should because his chair isn't just a seat, it's a kind of anchor point for his identity, a place where his voice carries more weight, where his opinions feel more grounded, more fixed. And when he speaks from that position, there's a sense that he's not just reacting to the moment. He's repeating something he has said before, something he believes deeply enough that it doesn't need to change. Mike is nearby, already tuned into that rhythm, already aware that whatever Archie says might not be new, might not be surprising, but will still demand a response. Because even if the words are familiar, the act of hearing them again creates a new moment, a new opportunity to push back, to question, to challenge. Gloria moves between them, carrying that familiar tension, that awareness that this conversation has happened before in some form, that it might happen again, and that her role in it is always complicated, always tied to her relationships rather than the ideas being discussed. And brings that same gentle presence, that same instinct to soften things, to smooth over the edges, to remind everyone without saying it directly, that repetition doesn't have to lead to escalation, even though it often does. The conversation starts with something small, something that feels almost routine. Maybe a comment about how things are changing, maybe a remark about how people behave differently now. And Archie responds in a way that feels familiar, not just to the audience, but to the other characters, like he's stepping into a role he has played many times before. And that's where the repetition begins. Because Mike doesn't just hear Archie's comment as a single statement. He hears it as part of a pattern, part of a larger set of beliefs that he has already challenged, already argued against, already tried to dismantle in previous conversations. And so he responds, and his response, too, carries a kind of repetition, not in the sense that he's saying the exact same thing, but in the sense that he's approaching the same idea from a slightly different angle, trying again to explain, to clarify, to make his perspective understood. At first, it still feels like a discussion, like something that could move forward, that could evolve. But then Archie responds again, and his response brings the conversation back to where it started, back to the same point, the same belief, the same certainty. And that's when you realize this isn't a linear conversation. It's circular. It moves, but it returns. It builds, but it repeats. And each time it returns, it carries a little more weight. Gloria steps in, trying to break the cycle, trying to push the conversation in a new direction. But her efforts are met with the same patterns, the same responses, the same underlying tension that keeps pulling everything back to the original point. Tries, too, offering something softer, something less confrontational, something that might allow the conversation to shift. But even her kindness becomes part of the rhythm, part of the repetition. A familiar attempt to ease the tension that doesn't quite resolve it. And this is where the episode becomes something more than just a conversation. It becomes a study of how people repeat themselves, not because they have nothing new to say, but because they feel that what they've already said hasn't been heard, hasn't been understood, hasn't been accepted. Archie repeats himself because he believes in what he's saying, because he feels that it should be obvious, because he doesn't see a reason to change his perspective. Mike repeats himself because he believes that Archie hasn't fully understood his argument, because he feels that if he can just explain it differently, it might finally connect. And Gloria and repeat themselves in their own ways, trying to maintain balance, trying to soften the edges, trying to keep the conversation from becoming something more damaging. But the repetition doesn't resolve anything. It deepens everything. Each return to the same point adds another layer of frustration, another layer of misunderstanding, another layer of emotional weight that makes the conversation feel more intense, even if the words themselves haven't changed that much. And that's where the show's brilliance really comes into focus, because it understands that tension doesn't always come from escalation. It can come from persistence, from the refusal to move on, from the act of staying in the same space and repeating the same ideas until they start to feel heavier, more personal, more charged. The living room becomes almost symbolic of that process, a space where everything happens in close proximity, where there's no real escape from the conversation, where repetition isn't just possible, it's inevitable. There's no cutaway, no distraction, no shift to another storyline to give you relief. You stay there. You listen. You feel the repetition. And it becomes the driving force of the episode. This was incredibly groundbreaking at the time, because television wasn't built around this kind of structure. It wasn't built around conversations that didn't progress in a traditional sense, that didn't move cleanly from point A to point B to point C. Instead, it allowed for something messier, something more reflective of real life, where conversations often circle, where people repeat themselves, where understanding isn't achieved in a single exchange. The humor, too, comes from that repetition, from the way Archie's certainty becomes almost ironic the more he repeats it, from the way Mike's persistence becomes both admirable and slightly exhausting, from the way Gloria's reactions grow sharper as the conversation circles back again and again, from the way gentle attempts to intervene feel both comforting and tragically ineffective. And there's something about that kind of humor that feels more honest, more grounded, because it doesn't rely on surprise, it relies on recognition, on the sense that you've seen this before, that you've been part of conversations like this, that you understand the rhythm even if you wish it would change. As the episode continues, the repetition doesn't stop, but it changes in tone, in intensity, in emotional weight. What started as a casual exchange becomes something more serious, more personal, more difficult to navigate, and the repeated ideas begin to carry more than just their original meaning. They begin to carry the history of the conversation itself, the frustration of not being understood, the discomfort of not being able to move forward. And yet it keeps going, because that's what people do. Oh, they repeat. They try again. They circle back. They hope that this time, something will land differently. And as a viewer, you start to feel that cycle, not just intellectually, but emotionally. You start to feel the weight of the repetition, the way it builds tension without needing to escalate in obvious ways. By the time the episode moves toward its conclusion, there's no clear resolution, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense, no final statement that ties everything together. Instead, there's a kind of quiet slowing down, a gradual fading of the intensity, not because the conversation has been resolved, but because it has exhausted itself, because the repetition has reached a point where it can't continue in the same way. But even then, it doesn't feel finished. It feels paused. It feels like something that could start again at any moment, with the same ideas, the same responses, the same patterns. And that's what makes it so real. Because in real life, conversations like this don't end cleanly. They don't resolve in a single moment. They continue, they resurface, they repeat over time. Personally, I think that's why episodes like this stay with you, not because of a specific moment or a memorable line, but because of the way they capture something true about how people communicate, how they struggle to be understood, how they keep trying even when it feels like nothing is changing. It's a reminder that repetition isn't always meaningless. Sometimes it's the only way people know how to express what matters to them, even if it leads to tension, even if it doesn't lead to resolution. And as the episode ends, you're left with that feeling, that quiet awareness that the conversation isn't really over, that it exists beyond the frame, beyond the scene, in the ongoing relationships between the characters. It doesn't close. It lingers. It repeats. And in that repetition, it finds its meaning.